Greetings! Our focus for today is the food chain and food web within an ecosystem. In our previous video, we discussed the details of the biotic and abiotic components that shape an ecosystem. Within the biotic component, it's fascinating to note that producers, also known as autotrophs, play a vital role in generating chemical energy in the form of food. This source of food then becomes nourishment for herbivores, the primary consumers, as well as omnivores. Progressing along the trophic levels, herbivores find themselves on the menu for carnivores, the secondary consumers. This sequence of consumption forms a linkage similar to a chain, illustrating the interconnectedness of life. Our topic for today is to understand the dynamic flow of food or energy through diverse organisms in this intricate dance of life. Food chain. In general terms, a chain is a series of connected links or elements arranged in a linear or sequential fashion. Likewise, a food chain is the connected links of a series of organisms arranged in a linear fashion based on their feeding pattern. In this example, the solar energy, fixed by the grass as chemical energy, is transferred to grasshopper, and the grasshopper is eaten by the frog. Thus, the energy is transferred to frog and then to the snake. So, this is a food chain. Here is another example of a food chain starting from a plant leaf. A food chain can be more precisely defined like this. The food chain is a linear representation of the flow of energy and nutrients in an ecosystem, illustrating the feeding relationships between different organisms. It shows how energy is transferred from one organism to another as they consume and are consumed by one another. You can try to write some food chains from your general awareness and understanding of the food habits of different organisms. Here are two examples, one in the aquatic environment and the other in the terrestrial ecosystem. The food chain typically starts with producers at the bottom and progresses through primary consumers, secondary consumers, and sometimes tertiary consumers at the top. It shows how energy is transferred from one organism to another as they consume and are consumed by one another. Food web. In nature, the food chain or the linear transfer of food energy is rare because the feeding relationships are more complex. One of the organisms may be the food for many other organisms. For example, grass is food for grasshoppers, rabbits, mice, and so on. The grasshoppers are eaten by lizard, as well as hawk. This way, we observe a more complex relationship of transfer of food energy, unlike the linear food chain. So, the food web is a more realistic representation of the complex interactions among organisms in an ecosystem, highlighting the diverse feeding relationships and the interdependence of different species. Two types of food chains are present in the ecosystem. Grazing food chain. This type of food chain starts from the living green plants, goes to grazing herbivores, and on to carnivores. An ecosystem with such type of food chain is directly dependent on an influx of solar radiation. Detritus food chain. This type of food chain goes from dead organic matter into microorganisms and detrivores. At the initial stage of the detritus food chain, decomposers and detrivers come into play. Decomposers, such as bacteria and fungi, break down the decaying organic substances into simpler compounds. Detrivers, which include organisms like earthworms, millipedes, and woodlice, feed on the dead organic matter directly. This is an example of a grazing food chain in a marine ecosystem. Phytoplankton are microscopic photosynthetic organisms that float near the surface of water bodies. They are primary producers. Zooplankton are small heterotrophic organisms that consume phytoplankton as well as other organic matter present in the water. They are primary consumers. Small fish feed on zooplankton and sometimes other small organisms. They are secondary consumers. Large fish, often referred to as apex predators or tertiary consumers, occupy the top of the food chain. Some examples of large fish include tuna, swordfish, and sharks. The second one is the example of another grazing food chain in a terrestrial ecosystem, starting from grass to grasshopper, to frog, to snake, and finally to the owl. Here is an example of a detritus food chain. The detritus food chain plays a crucial role in ecosystem functioning by recycling and decomposing organic matter. At the initial stage of the detritus food chain, decomposers and detritivores come into play. Decomposers, such as bacteria and fungi, break down the decaying organic substances into simpler compounds. Detritivores, which include organisms like earthworms, millipedes, and woodlice, feed on the dead organic matter directly. The difference between decomposers and detrivers is that decomposers do not ingest or eat the dead organic matter, but the detrivers eat or ingest the dead organic matter. Now you should be able to explain the food chain and food web in an ecosystem. Differentiate between grazing and detritus food chain. And explain the role of the detritus food chain. In the next episode, we will understand trophic level in an ecosystem. Thank you.